So we are continuing on page 206 of the Portable Seminary, continuing on in the background to the Old Testament. Quite a bit has been covered so far up to this point. We've been talking mostly about the setting in the biblical context. We've been talking about the geology, the cultures and so forth that were around, and talking about the placement. And it is considered by God's divine providence that He placed His people right there in this place that we talk about, within the Fertile Crescent, and within the land bridge that brings all of the cultures in contact with God's people. In turn, it brings God's people in contact with all the other cultures as well. And just in getting started with the literary setting, it's also something to remember and understand that God's people, the Hebrew, it is said that the surrounding cultures had more effect on them than they had on the surrounding cultures. We see that quite literally, quite often within the Old Testament, within the Hebrew Bible, as it is being revealed to them. They are being, their actions and activities result in things that are being revealed to them throughout. And so we see this falling back, if you will, that occurs as they meet up against or come in contact with other cultures, that tends to draw them away from their own core culture that God is trying to build. And so we see, if you were to do a study from start to finish of the Old Testament, what we call the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, you would see a testimony to people that get it right and then fall back, and then get it right and then fall back. And that's what we see throughout. When we start to read the Hebrew Bible, it right away, the first thing that you notice is that its original audience, if you will, the Hebrew people or God's people that were becoming or coming about as Hebrew, they had an absolute sense that this was for sure and definitely, this was or is God's revealed word. They tend to, so because of that, it has power and authority over them right away. The literary medium that God uses or used in the revelation of the Old Testament, He used to record the revelation, not just of Himself, but His will for His people and His will upon His people. And His will was not unique, really, in that other cultures and other peoples had a sense, sort of, well, definitely of right and wrong, because God has made all people, and we are all endowed with this sense. But they were also had a sense that there was a higher power, and they had a feeling about it, and so they had this understanding around them in the broader sense. The biblical literature was not all that much different because of this. It was not all that much different from the literature of the surrounding people or groups. To two factors involved in that, and that is that the Hebrew people, as they were writing, as the prophets, as these revelations were coming, the Hebrew people were also influenced by the cultures and the societies around them, and they were educated basically in the same manner, in the same way. So they were influenced by the Renaissance that occurred around them. Each time it did, they were influenced by that, and so their writing, the styles and the particular the particular ways in which they write are quite similar to the cultures around them. It's that influence that keeps coming back. It's the influence of God over his people, and then the influence of the cultures around his people that influence them again, with God intervening and so forth and so on. That becomes quite interesting as you start realizing that as you're reading, that's what's going on. And then it tends to also make what we read and what we understand very interesting, because as we put it into context in that fashion, it takes on not just a meaning for them then, but we see that it is absolutely corollary, and is absolutely, even in context, brings a meaning that is contemporary to us now. And that is part of the magnificence of the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible. With that understanding, and as we take that with us, the thought that the biblical literature was not all that much different from the literature of the surrounding people groups, it's interesting then to look at the literature of those groups, of the societies and the cultures that were around them, that helped, maybe not helped is the right word, but absolutely influenced them and were being influenced by them. The ancient Near Eastern literature is absolutely, it is interesting to say the least. And there are quite a lot of parallels and correlation between the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, and some of the ancient writings that we have unearthed since, and have that we can study, see, and actually touch and feel, because of the additional digs and the projects that are going on in the Middle East, in those areas in North Africa and so forth and so on. We are unearthing just a treasure trove of information, literally libraries full of information, that we can pick up, and we can translate, we can and read, understand what was going on during those times. Under primeval history, at the bottom of 206, page 206, we see the author is talking of the creation stories. And within those creation stories, there are several. Actually, every culture has one. It's amazing to me that how much similar they are. Even without direct contact between those cultures prior to, each culture comes up with something that is kind of similar. They didn't have all of the facts, because they didn't have the God who did that telling them specifically what happened and how it happened. But they worked it out kind of feebly on their own and come up with something that is very similar. Um, Atrahasis tells of gods weary of labor, creating humans to relieve them of responsibilities. I think that that's kind of if we look at that and we kind of bear down on that a little bit, we're going to see ourselves in that writing. If gods are not going to become weary, if they were in fact and true gods, they would not. But if we were writing this story, we would say, yes, you were created so that I don't have to do that anymore. And I can see that in there. There's a bit of humanistic want and realization within that sort of story. Enuma Elish speaks of Marduk's rise to the top of the Babylonian pantheon. Of course, the pantheon means the gallery of gods. All of their gods put together would be a pantheon. And of course, Marduk was he was the top god in the Babylonian pantheon. He was said to have created the world with the corpse of another god, and that god is Tiamat. Humans were created from the blood of Kinju or Kingu. I think it's Kinju, who was another slain god. So we can see in that, as we read those texts and we understand then what they're writing about, we can kind of see also a glimpse at their culture. Yes, the Babylonians were known for their education. They were known for their cultural advances. They were known for their architecture, and they were known for a lot of things. But they were also known to be quite violent, and they were known to be a warrior culture that would simply devour their enemies. And so we see that kind of as it comes out in their writings and their beliefs, even as they're creating these gods. These gods are created in their image, as opposed to what we know through our revelation of the Word of God, that we are created in His image. So there's the difference there, but it's kind of interesting as you go through and you see these things that they each have a creation story. How did I get here? That's the question. It's a universal question. It goes from the beginning of time, as we have the ability to reason and question. This is one of those questions that we seek to be answered by our God first and foremost. Why or how? How did I get here, and why am I here? So that's on the one side. That's on the northeast side, if you will, of the land bridge and those pressures that are coming down from that way. What about the southwest? And we're looking at Egypt and the kingdom and kingdoms of Egypt of the time. Memphis was the prime city for quite some time in Egypt. And in Egypt, we have the Memphite theology of creation, which gives prime place to Ptah. He is the patron deity of Memphis, and he was the patron god. Ptah, created by the teeth and lips of his mouth. In other words, we see a vision, if you will, of this God, Ptah, who speaks and it is created. He creates by speaking it into existence. But in contrast, that should be sufficient, you would think, but in the Memphite theology of creation, there's also a contrasting God named Etum, and Etum created by semen and by his fingers. So he would have to manipulate things. So he would manipulate things and create them, and Ptah would speak them into existence. It's interesting to when we consider these things, and these are not just. This is just a basic background. If you look into all of the other cultures, the Mesopotamian culture that leads into the Assyrian culture and so forth and so on. Each one has a creation story, a creation belief, and each one of them, although there are parts of it that are similar in nature, really the similarity is that we are trying to get an understanding of where we come from and why we are here. And that's the universal question, and these stories, if you will, are trying to get that answered. In the midst of that, we have our God, the God, who is revealing to his people the reality. All these other stories that are going on and around, spinning around and around, that they can create and manipulate based on their own image and their own wants, based on their own needs. And then we have, in the midst of all of that, we have the God of the Hebrews, our God, revealing the reality. And the reality is thus. And I find that comparison kind of stark. The other thing that is interesting is that there is, across cultures, a story of the flood that serves the very same purpose that is all across these cultures. It serves the same purpose, and that is, in short, to say it's a start over. God was not happy, was annoyed with, and needed to wipe out humankind in order to start over. That's the overarching story, the overarching understanding across all of these various cultures. Just a few of them. We find flood literature, if you will, as far back as the early Bronze Age in Mesopotamia. And Mesopotamia tells of a natural disaster resulting from the displeasure of the gods. Now, there's a sort of an understanding there, but they didn't quite get it right, did they? It tells of one king who escaped the impending extinction of humankind by boarding a boat. In that story, it also includes not just the boarding of a boat, but the animals and supplies as well. And so I find that very interesting as well. Cross-cultural, and even far before we see this acknowledgement that this is a historical reality. I find that very, 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 very interesting. So the flood theme is found not just there in Mesopotamia, but we also find it in the Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, Hittite, Hurrian texts, and others as well. As they are uncovering more and more, they find more and more that this is across culture and typically across time and eras, that this is there. And the further back they go, The more ancient and ancient they can find, they're finding the very same thing there. So the fact, the historical fact that it occurred is cross-cultural. It's multicultural, and it spans the length of time as well. So those are, again, as we look on one side of the Fertile Crescent, we can look to the other end of the Fertile Crescent and take a look at the literature that comes out of there and see if we can find something that correlates. And in fact, we do. So the Sumerians, if you will, the Chaldean culture have these writings and these ideas of the flood. And then you look again to the other side, clear at the other end of the Fertile Crescent, into the Egyptians' culture, and you find within the Book of Dead, we find fragments of a flood story that are preserved there. So it isn't just that a culture touched another and they passed on this story. We're looking at two separate cultures that were separated by land mass and traditionally, separated completely, especially back in the Bronze Age. And we find the same context. In the same context, we find a similar story, and that is of the flood. Why is this important? Well, this is important because we can look extra biblical. In other words, we can look outside the Bible to historical documents, historical documentation, libraries of old and ancient knowledge and so forth, and we can find points of truth that point directly to the truth and the authority of the Hebrew Bible. Not only that, but we can do that throughout the entire Bible, the Old Testament and New Testament. There's something else that comes through the literary, the ancient Near Eastern literature that is available to us as we study, as it becomes available and we study it, we see a treatment of the law, and actually the creation of law and the establishment of law goes back beyond and into the early Bronze Age as well. And it's preserved in Mesopotamia. And Mesopotamia and the kingdoms there are credited with creating and establishing the first laws that we're able to look at. One of the oldest found so far is the Code of Namu. Namu, the founder of the dynasty that fostered the Sumerian Renaissance at the end of the 3rd millennium BC. The surviving portion demonstrates a concern to foster social justice and to banish malediction, violence, and strife with both civil and criminal code. That sounds awfully familiar, doesn't it? And we still, even today, almost 6,000 years since, and here we are still establishing new laws, trying to recreate and mold into existence new laws that will bring about this very thing, this social justice. There's something to be said there as well, and with the coming and the realization of the Old Testament and God's understanding of justice, there is a clarification that occurs from there in the 19th century BC laws and the what is that, the third millennium, so that'd be 3000 BC, those kinds of things. We see this continued search for social justice when as God reveals to his people in the Old Testament, the justice that he reveals is a true and pure justice. And if you have to modify the term, with an adjective, that perverts justice, which we in a biblical term would understand that. So as that demonstrates a concern for the same thing that we still are concerned with. In fact, if we were to just be completely obedient, that would solve itself. The problem is that our cultures are not completely obedient to God and his law, and therefore we have to create our own in order to try to better serve, if you will, the public. I find that interesting. Going on page 207, a little past midway down, he goes on, he says, the 19th century BC laws of Eshnunna are a combination of civil and criminal law. From the same century, the Code of Lipit Ishtar is focused on civil law, and that was bringing suit or torts against one another and trying to live a civil life within the community. And we see that these were created by the kings and those in authority over, trying to exert their authority over their subjects. The most well-known, as it goes on, and extensive code is called the Code of Hammurabi. Most of us have heard of that. It was derived in the 18th century BC. There's 282 provisions that are preserved there. And it's interesting to take a look at what those are. There's many parallels between the Hebrew law and the laws of their neighbors. As these laws were being generated, as they were being written and placed into law in these kingdoms that continued to move around and continued to exert their power, if you will, over one another, they started clashing, and in some places they started meshing, so forth and so on. And so the Hebrew people were well aware of what laws were elsewhere as they would travel, and people had to be made aware of what the laws were within the kingdom of Israel, as they're traveling through. So this lends itself again as those literary practices, if you will, come in contact with the Hebrew, and the Hebrew come in contact with the other. There is a meshing and a molding, and because of that, there's many parallels. But there's parallels between the Hebrew law and the laws of their neighbors, mostly because of the creation, as God created all of us, as we are created in his image. We are created with this internal understanding of right and wrong, and not just black and white, not just right and wrong, but we have we have the ability to rationalize it and to consider it and understand it. We can not just see the what, but we can then, because of the what and the outcomes, we can determine the why. And so it may take them a long while, thousands of years, to develop these laws that are on the books that are decrees from the king for good order. They really do. They come by way of God and what he has placed in them as right and wrong. So that's why there is a parallel between the two. As God reveals his law to his people, it's going to look in places like what mankind has rationalized out on his own using this gift from God, the knowledge of right and wrong, and being able to rationalize and consider the why of it, what is good about it, and what the outcome will or should be. But there's also some significant differences as we take a look at and compare what the Hebrews had, what was revealed to them by God as their commandments, their laws. There are some significant differences. The great law codes from Mesopotamian cultures are based on the king's authority. The Hebrew law is given by God long before Israel even had a king. And one result is that Mesopotamian law, the codes of the law, they are secular, which means they're made by man and therefore can be broken by man. Whereas the Hebrew law is sacred, it is made by God, and there is not sufficient authority on earth to break or change that. That's the overarching higher difference that there is. The Hebrew law provides a theological basis as well, a theological basis for its civil and criminal code. We still use much of this today, and we call it Judeo-Christian beliefs and systems, and we still use much of this today. Why? Well, because it's not arbitrary, right? And it transcends time. It transcends culture. It's not based on any culture, but it's based on God's will for us. And so we find that we still use it today because it put in context, it is good and true then, before then, now, and it will be. As it is the same with God, it is the same with his truth. The truth is the truth, never changing and never will. And that's part of the reason why we use it. Not only that, but we can also see as we recognize the law, as we hear the law, as we try to be obedient to God's law, we can rationalize in our own minds and understand that it is good. When we live by his law, we are in good standing with him. And if we are in good standing with him, we are in good standing with one another. And that transcends the cultural problems, issues, and so forth, and including and also transcends that attempt at social justice as well. The other part of that, the other side, the downside, if you will, some people look at that. When we're talking about law, you were talking not just about obedience to, but we're talking about what happens when we run a scoff of the law and if we violate the law. Well, there's a difference there too when we look at what is secular and what is sacred. The violation of Mesopotamian law, if you consider that, is considered an infraction. This is much the same as if we were to if we were to break the law here in America or there, wherever you are. If you break the law, it's considered an infraction. It's secular, right? But a violation of Hebrew law, it is given by God, by His authority. That's not simply an infraction, because that is sacred law. The Hebrew law is considered sin, and that takes on an entirely different message, and it takes on an entirely different weight as well. Moving on then to page 208 in Kings and Prophets. Again, we're still talking about, the literary influence, if you will, of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. And we see, as we were talking and have been talking about the influence of various cultures, we can also see through the kings and the contemporary, if you will, prophets, quote unquote, of the times, of those times, we have quite a bit. We have a huge library of unearthed documents and early writings from Mesopotamia and places like that that we have uncovered and have been able to spend years and years studying. A collection of almost 400 cuneiform tablets called the Amarna Letters. You might want to know that for the test. The Amarna Letters were mostly letters from vassal kings in Canaan and Syria. Okay, and so we're talking about the kingdoms, the Canaan region, the kingdom of Canaan, which was part of that land bridge, and of course Syria being the power, if you will, the kingdom power at the north east side of that. They were discovered in the remains of an archives of Amenhotep the third, and that was a very famous discovery. Those are dated at 1402 to 1363. That's quite a big span for that era, BC. And then Akhenaten, 1363 to 1347 BC. The significant body of historical texts from both Mesopotamia and Egypt, the first one, Amenhotep the third, is from the Mesopotamian area. Akhenaten is from the Egyptian area. It's significant. There's full university disciplines in Assyriology and Egyptology that have come out of just these findings. They are so rich and massive amounts of knowledge that is revealed, not just about the culture and the social issues of the time, but there's of the sciences that were known at the time, and so forth and so on. So that it's not just the knowledge that's revealed, but also it gives us a basis to look at history and establish historical facts based on what we read and then therefore know from these libraries. There's been, complete studies, and like it says, there's complete disciplines on this now that bring us more and more and more understanding. And each time they bring us more, Each time they find more, each time there's something more uncovered, we find more and more there is truth lent to the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, its writings, its historical accuracy, and its claims. And each and every time that there is an attempt at trying to find something controversial, find something that is contradictory to what we know that God has revealed to us in the Hebrew Bible, they fail. And all their attempt does is continue to solidify our position that the revealed Word of God is true and accurate and can be relied upon. That's why this is so important to us. There were also some prophetic writings that occurred in both areas, in both eras, that are quite interesting as well. Now, they're called prophetic not because they were called by God to speak prophetic words, but because they spoke against current culture of the times. They spoke against current political ideas of the times, things like that, where they were warning the king of impending doom. They were warning the king of certain aspects of life or culture, and things like that. And those are also contained there. There's one that is that I have read and is really interesting. If you have some time ever in your ministry and so forth, you might want to take a look at these. But the admonitions of Ipuwer, and and then there's the prophecies of Neferti. Um, they reflect a prophetic role of challenging the community and the king in making predictions. They're a different kind of prophet than what we understand as we look into the Old Testament and the Hebrew Bible. They're a different kind of prophet. They were people that were educated, that could understand, that could move, rationalize and so forth, and they could see things that were going to occur. They weren't necessarily used as an oracle. But it's interesting because we get to see the problems of the cultures, and the issues of the times, and we can then look at and see the pressures that were put upon the Hebrew people as the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, was being revealed in its process, um, that ended up being the process of canon, um, as it became a reality.